Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Andrew from Game Changers, and I wanted to shoot this little video to talk a little bit about arrays. It's a very simple concept, but it ends up coming up a lot in a lot of different places, and I see a lot of questions in the forums, both the GlobiFlow forum and the ProcFu forum, talking about, JSON and how we manage it and how we can kind of get the most out of ProcFu, and see some behaviors and some people asking questions that I just figure it would be great to maybe just talk about, just break them down. Because we often talk about, we marvel at the complexity of Podio and all these crazy things that we can do, but we often forget to just sort of talk about the basics as well. And this is a pretty basic concept, but it's super helpful for everybody. So I thought I would try to help everybody out and talk a little bit about it. And JSON specifically, I'm going to talk about a couple different types of arrays, but this concept of JSON, JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, is a sort of standard data object in JavaScript, but it's used by pretty much every API out there. Any RESTful APIs. So basically, any API where you're just calling a particular endpoint with an array or some kind of information, and then you're expecting something back. Most of them use JSON as the way you request information and the way that you receive information. And the Podio API is exactly the same. They use JSON for requests and for receiving responses. So I see a couple of other things too. A couple of main motivations for me wanting to do this. Number one, I see people writing JSON by hand, which is very dangerous because if you miss out on escaping certain characters, then the whole thing sort of falls apart. And it's very time consuming as well, seeing people write JSON sort of from scratch. There are much better tools that you can use to help yourself do this. And also, when it comes to receiving JSON from APIs, I see some people using things like pregmatch or pregmatch to parse out the JSON for what you're looking for, and this works, but it's also something that could be improved with better tools. So just a couple of things, couple of motivations, and just want to talk about sort of the basics here. And I'm going to show you some examples along the way, which talk a little bit first about what an array is, for again starting from scratch, and then we can kind of get into some examples. So an array is a standard object we see in most programming languages. It's kind of like a miniature. I sometimes call it like a mini database. It's really just a variable that can hold multiple values. So you have a variable that's like name equals first name equals Andrew. That's one value, but an array can hold multiple values inside the one variable, and we can use that one variable to move information around. Um, we can hold, single variables like the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in an array, and then we can call those options. We refer to that as an indexed array. And then we've also got another type of array, which is called an associative array, where you can actually store, what a piece of particular value is about, and then the value itself, like first name, last name, phone number, email address, that kind of stuff. And you'll see a lot of associative arrays across, using different APIs, again, including Podio. And then you can have a combination of the two. So you can have an array of arrays. Basically, if you had like consider a person to be an object, and you have like first name, last name, email address, phone number, and you want to have an array of all of those data points, but then you have four or five people, and you want to have an array of all of them together, well, then you could see an array of associative arrays, and we'll see an example of that as well when we get to the examples. From a GlobiFlow perspective, there's only two type of arrays we need to be concerned with. GlobiFlow is essentially a PHP environment. The things that we use all the time, like the date function, um, str replace, pregmatch. These are all PHP functions that you could do in a regular PHP environment if you just opened up a new text file and named it PHP and started writing this code. Some of it would work. We need to sort of use a PHP array to um, wrangle information inside of variables. Because, like I said, GlobiFlow is a PHP environment, so we need to use that function. But most of all, we're going to be using the JSON array of functions as well. And we have two functions right inside PHP and GlobiFlow, JSON encode and JSON decode. We're going to see examples of both. So we need both of these really in order to wrangle through some challenges, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So you can see JSON, like I said, most APIs use JSON format. It's pretty standard nowadays. Most of the examples that you see that are like a request body or a response body, they're generally associative arrays because they're sending back and forth information like a person's first name or last name. JSON arrays are always contained in curly brackets, and each key value pair is separated by a colon. So you can see double quotes here. Single quotes also work. Oh, I'm missing one. Oh, look at that. See. And then everything is comma separated. So we can have multiple key value pairs, but everything happens to be separated by a comma. And then what you can actually put as a value in an array, both from a PHP perspective and a JSON perspective, we see strings, which is like double quotes or single quote, like a piece of text. Integers, no quotes, just a number. Boolean, true or false. Other arrays, which we also see a lot of examples of as well. And another important thing is this concept of null. Because when you're working with APIs, like even the Podio API is an example, um, null is not the same as an empty string. And sometimes when you try to pass an empty string to a field, it will not work. It says it must be, it must have a value or it must be null. And an empty string is not a value. It's something completely different. So null is an important data type as well to include in these lists of data types that we need to wrangle. So we can write JSON arrays right in GlobiFlow, send them to APIs. We're going to show you some examples using just procfoo, but it's the same thing. Procfoo is just a gateway to the Podio API where your authentication access to the Podio API is managed directly in procfoo, which makes it such a sexy addition to GlobiFlow. And see this, but there's some challenges inside GlobiFlow that we sort of have to address as well. Because not everything works right out of the box. There's a couple of little sort of issues that we have to figure out. So first of all, every single custom variable that you use in GlobiFlow, so you have like a date function to find out the date, or maybe you're building an HTML table in variables. There's lots of use for variables. Everything gets converted to a string at the end. So once the flow fires and everything goes through, all of those variables end up being strings in the eye of the rest of the flow. And and this can be a problem because PHP arrays, when they get converted to a string, they only show up as the word array. So we're going to see examples of this, and that's not useful. Like you've spent, a lot of time writing an array, and then all of a sudden all you get back is the word array. It's not great. So if we want to move from variable to variable, we want to, use a for each function to collect information, or to build our own JSON, we need to use JSON encode, and we can do a combination of these two things, both a PHP array and a JSON array. But at the end, we want to have a JSON array because it will be a string. It's stored as a string, and then it will happily go from variable to variable. And also, there's some issues with escaped characters, like when you see double quotes. And I'm going to show you some, like a Podio item with a double quote in a text field. If we just use JSON straight up in GlobiFlow and we try to read values like this, where these characters haven't been escaped properly, which is to have the front slashes in front of them, then it will just return false. It won't give you anything. So it can kind of feel like you're not getting a good result, but really it's just the result of these characters not being escaped properly. The good news is that there is a procedure we can use to fix this, and it is for to base64 encode a JSON string that will then be able to, when we catch JSON from somewhere. That's really the main example we'll see here. When we catch JSON, if the characters aren't, GlobiFlow does not escape everything properly, then it returns false. If we base64 encode the string first before GlobiFlow even looks at it, and then we base64 decode that string, GlobiFlow will actually escape everything properly, and it will actually show up, and we can start to work with it. So procfoo has a script to handle this issue. And it's not always necessary. It really all depends on what you're bringing into the GlobiFlow environment. As an example, just to say, like the Asana API, when you're looking at things in the Asana API, or you're looking at any API where you're just dealing with identification numbers, basically all you're getting back is numbers. No possibility of things like double quotes or any characters that need to be escaped. Then you wouldn't have to bother base 64 encoding, because you're not going to get anything that's going to cause you issues. It's really on a case by case basis. But multi-line text fields are a perfect example of double quotes slipping in there, people writing out long bits of text. So that's one, any Podio item where you have a multi-line text field, I would base 64 just for safety's sake. But it's up to you. You have to really figure out what you need it for. So those are just some basics. You can see, like, we've got some tools that we can use to make our lives a little bit easier. Now let's talk about some examples here. So I have a very basic Podio app set up, just a bunch of items. You can see I have item 1, item 2, item 3. I'm using a category field, single choice category field, and a number field. And I'm going to interact with these items in a number of different ways, from an array perspective and from a JSON perspective, so that we can see kind of what's going on. So first, let's talk about PHP. So GlobiFlow is essentially a PHP scripting environment. That all of these custom variables, you're using PHP code. That's what you're using. So an array, a PHP array, is a very standard practice. When anybody's using PHP, it's used all the time. It's a very handy thing, as you can see especially when you're interacting with other APIs. And how we would build an array is to use either the array function, and a function is like a parentheses, call the array function, and then put inside what you want the array to be. And it's all comma separated items. And it goes back to the data types we were talking about before: strings, integers, boolean, null, array, other arrays, all of this stuff. So whatever data types you're tracking, these are all strings, as our example, comma separated. And then we can see we get an array back. This is kind of GlobiFlow's version of telling us that we've built an array. So we're storing multiple values in one variable that we're calling indexed array. And you can see the index here. All the indexes always start with 0. So the 0 index is item 1, the first index is item 2, and the second index is item 3. We've got 3 items in our array. The index always starts with 0. It's a very important concept to wrap your brain around when you're doing any of this stuff with arrays. And then we have an associative array, which is a key and a value pair, and this is PHP's operator to separate the two. So this is a PHP array. I know I said that a JSON array, the separator is a colon, but in this environment it's a little bit different. And we're going to be writing our arrays in PHP most of the time, and then encoding them as JSON so that they'll come back in the right format when they have to be read as JSON. But this is the operator to actually indicate the difference between a key and a value in PHP. And here I'm also using the other type of operator we can use to indicate an array, which is the square brackets. So I've got 2 different kinds of arrays. So if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to check out what the results of these arrays were going to be, I can simulate variables, and I can see I've built my indexed array. Looks pretty good when I simulate variables, and I can see my key value pair is pretty good. But then when I go to read them, all I get is array. Because as we said, GlobiFlow converts everything to a string. Array to string conversion just shows the word array, and then we've lost it all forever. In a PHP environment, I should be able to grab an index from the array, and I should be able to grab a key from the array as well. But as you can see, when I simulate variables, this is not going to work. This just returns the first letter in both cases. So I've lost out on some PHP, effect that I can get. But that's okay, because I've got JSON to help me out, and we're trying to do as much in GlobiFlow as we possibly can. So we've got solutions to deal with this problem. So now let's talk about a JSON array. So we are writing a PHP array. You can see inside we've contained a PHP array here. Same thing that we had on the previous flow, but we're wrapping it in the JSON encode function. And what this is going to do is it's going to convert the eventual array into a JSON array. And we can see here it's a little bit different, right? So separated by colons, and we've got the operators outside for array. And then if I have a associative array, same thing. Now we can see it starts to look more like JSON, like we showed before. Curly brackets, a key value pair separated by a colon. So it does all the work for us in terms of JSON. This is why it doesn't make any sense to write your JSON from scratch, because if there's any characters that have to be escaped, GlobiFlow will take care of that for you as well. It looks like it makes sense to write your JSON from scratch, like it just basically inside a string, and it does end up being a string anyway. But you know, this is just so much easier. It's just so much easier to use it this way. Whatever works for you, but I highly recommend you check this out. So now, if I take a look at what my strings are, I'm going to get both of these same strings that I just showed you here, and then I can use the JSON decode function, which is the other way, to break it up and get the results. So what I'm going to show you here is I can decode the indexed array to get the first option, and I'm going to get the first option in the array, whatever index 0 is. And then if I have JSON decode the associative array, we're going to have an issue here that we can fix with this colon true. Basically, my recommendation to you, because it doesn't harm indexed arrays, is to use comma true at the end of every JSON decode function that you do. And what comma true means is that it maintains the fact that it's an array, because otherwise it gets converted to an object, which again is like a particular type of like a data type. And it's good for storage, but it's not good for working with it again. If we want to grab the indexed result of an indexed array, or grab like a key value pair and it's already been converted to an object, we lose that ability. So comma true makes sure that we always have the ability to keep things as an array. And I would recommend that you always use it. There's no danger in always using it. We're going to see the error that it causes. When I try to do this, the associative array and grab a key, I'm not going to be able to do so because it's looking at an object, not an array, and JSON decode only works with arrays. But if I keep comma true, we'll be able to grab it. So now that we've explained everything here, let's simulate variables and take a look. Okay, so we have our JSON array, our indexed array. It's just the three items that we've combined. We've got our proper JSON associative array, which is the curly brackets, key value pairs separated by colons and comma separated. Now we can see. Okay, so these are my results. Okay, we see the same things. Now, so if I wanted to read item 0 of my indexed array, I would use 0, JSON decode 0, and then I would get the first item. So if I'm storing, just a bunch of things, I can use the index indicator to see which one that I want to get. Now you can see on a JSON decode, it's converting it to an object. Okay, it almost looks the same, but then I go to grab a value from it, and it returns false because it's not an array anymore. It's something else. Otherwise, I want to keep comma true. It looks the same from this perspective, but you can see now it's an array rather than an object, and then I can grab a key, and it would be square brackets and separated by single quotes or double quotes. They both work, indicating which key from the array you want, and then I get the value for that key. So JSON encode allows us to store arrays that are going to move beyond the variable in which they were created. And if we use PHP, they're going to get lost and they're going to get turned into array, but we want to have them so that we can do things with them. Because one of the perfect examples is using a for each function to build a JSON array of Podio items. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. Now, as we talked about before, when we're dealing with things like escaped characters, we have to be very careful about how GlobiFlow deals with the JSON, because at any point we might lose our array because we didn't escape something properly and then it returns false, and that's really bad in a for each function, because if it happens 2 or 3 items in of a 10 item for each, then you wouldn't necessarily see the results of everything. So we have this dance going on between base 64, which is just another type of encoding, just a bunch of random characters, a string that's converted to a bunch of random characters. It's not secure. It's really just for different software systems read information in different ways. I think base 64 is good for images. I'm not 100% sure, but I know it's there are software out there that read things in base 64 and then convert them back into what they have to be. It's like just a conversion function to send things around. But it's good for us because it escapes characters in our JSON for us, so that we can use them and then send them off to wherever they're eventually going to go. So if we look at this flow, what we're doing is we're calling a view. I'm just getting my items from my main view here that we talked about before. My test view, it's got 3 items in it. I set up a variable. This could just be null. Just as an example, I'm just creating a blank array with nothing in it at the moment. And then I'm going to go through each of the items. I'm going to first convert the JSON array into, or sorry, the JSON array into a PHP array. So this is a bit of pseudocode. There are better ways to do this in the PHP environment. There are actually functions that will let you add items to an array. None of them are available in GlobiFlow, but that's okay. We've got workarounds and things that we can work with. So what I'm doing is I'm turning the array back into a PHP array. I'm using the custom foo function. Another handy tool, if you don't use it very often, basically it lets us to do, a lot of PHP sort of logic inside one variable, and it's good for each. It's good for for loops. There's lots of different uses for it that you can find out in the GlobiFlow forum, probably just by searching foo. You can get some good examples. So I'm using a function here to grab a JSON array, turn it into a PHP array so I can work with it from a PHP perspective, and that's what I'm doing in the next step, adding an item to that array. And I'm adding another array. So now I'm going to have an array of arrays, have an array of 3 different arrays. And each of those subarrays, each of those items inside will contain a key value pair, and I'm just grabbing some information out of the Podio item, the 3 fields that I have, and the Podio item ID, which I'm storing. And if you're not storing the Podio item ID inside every item that you create in all of your Podio systems, I really think that you should think about it, because there's 100 million different ways, from a URL, automatically calculating URLs. You can automatically calculate external URL links by pulling in some base64 information into a Podio calculation field and actually calculate those links on an item by item basis. Just saves you time and actions. I found it to be immensely helpful. I think it was Rainier who first turned me on to that. So I would highly recommend you store all of the Podio item IDs for every item that's created within the item itself. You'll find huge value. I know that you can get it as a token, but sometimes you can't always get it that way. It's really super useful, especially for import, export purposes. Really super useful. So I'm doing it here. And then when I get back, I get the base64 encoded version of my JSON array, so I can store it. What I'm doing here, just as an example, just as a conversation piece, I love these scripts in procfoo where you can store variables. Like you can store a variable, give it a name, and then store the value of the variable, and then call it later on. So later on, we can call the same variable, and you can do it from anywhere. Sometimes it's nice, when you're running flows and you want to store certain bits of information and then call it from somewhere else. You can't send information from one flow to another. These scripts are really super useful for that, and I love to see them get pressed because I think they're really super cool. So what I'm doing here is I'm storing a JSON array, and I'm just storing it in a variable using procfoo for, let's say I want to have, rather than, as a real world example of why this would be useful, let's say you have an API that requires you to collect a bunch of information, a bunch of objects, arrays for like contacts. Let's say you want to make a call to an API, and what they want in the request body is an array of contacts that you want to affect change on. And rather than using GlobiFlow rather than call a view of 100 items, you wait. For each, use GlobiFlow to for each all 100 items. You get your JSON array and you send it off. That's all well and good. That's like a 5-minute, 10-minute procedure. Depends on how much data you're using. But if you had it set up so that every single time something entered that view, it updated a variable where the JSON was already stored, and it was just adding each time, then when the time came to make that API call, you could just grab that variable. Why wait? Boom, gone. So storing JSON can sometimes have its advantages as well. It's an interesting conversation piece. I'd be interested to hear some examples from the community about whether or not anybody's storing JSON. I know you can use Podio calculation fields to create JSON and then call it from other places. It's an interesting conversation piece to talk about what people are using JSON for, or arrays in general, because you can see they have a bunch of different uses, not just API calls, although that is the main reason why I use them on a daily basis. So that was me storing JSON, and this is me calling it back. So I'm just using the base64 decode function. Now, when I get back to my function here, and I'm turning it back into JSON one last time, and these two scripts with this variable basically returns what any API would return, which is to have a JSON array in a variable. But when you want to actually use it and get the information from it, when you call JSON to code on a particular bit of JSON in a variable and it hasn't been escaped properly, or GlobiFlow is not looking at it from the correct perspective, it will always return false, and you won't get the information that you need. So we've got this super handy script from procfoo that will base64 encode any information. And then you can make sure that you preserve all of the arrays if you're sending in an array of arrays. Send it this information, and then our backend function is a little bit more complicated, where we have to use both JSON decode and base64 decode. But this way we can always get the information. Everything will be escaped properly. We can pass information back and forth that has double quotes, and always get the information that we need from these arrays. So if I simulate variables over here, I'm using for each to build a JSON array that always comes out looking like base64 decode, and then it gets stored in procfoo. And then I come back and I grab the same variable in procfoo, and then this is another thing too, just to draw attention to it. GlobiFlow has a new function that's about a year old now, I guess, that you can use for each any variable that you call with a remote post or get. So if you're using procfoo and you're grabbing items from procfoo, I can grab some items. I'm going to show you an example, and then make sure we base64 encode them to return them back, and then we can for each them, and then use the for each function with the variable name in order to actually go through these items. And it's not like you're for eaching Podio items, you're for eaching JSON items or array items. And it's really super helpful. And I'm going to show you an example of actually you fooling the system into thinking you've collected it with a remote post get, and show you a particular operation that might be of use to you. So if I simulate variables over here, I get the result of my array. And we were for each of the items that I had. This is my JSON, my cleaned up JSON. It's all looking nice here. And then I for each of these items in the array. You see the array of arrays. The curly brackets indicate this is one item in the array, and it's an array. And then it's comma separated, and this is item number 2. It's always good to look at it from a pretty perspective, break it out, and you can see. One thing you might want to consider, and I'll put this up in the blog post as well. I have this little handy tool that actually cleans up JSON and makes it pretty. So you can drop in JSON and then format it, and you can look at it from a pretty perspective. That's way easier to look at, right? I mean, that's how we want to try to write it, but it's not always brilliant to do this in GlobiFlow. And then you can also view the items and break them up here. Very handy tool. Stacked JSONviewer.stack.hu. I'll put the link up for that so that you can see. Okay. And then I for each of those items, so we can see, okay, item 1, option 1, and we can go through all of my items, get the Podio item ID. So at any time, I could build JSON, store it, call it after, and then break it up and do different things with it. That's just like I said, a conversation piece. Now let's look at some actual real examples of how you can use procfoo and use arrays. This is just something I want to draw attention to. Like I said, let's imagine you had like a count of items. Let's say you had the number 5, and you didn't care, like all you wanted was to create 5 of something. One use I've had this before is like if you're building let's say you're building a property management system, and you want to have an item per bedroom. It comes in and says number of bedrooms 5. And you want to create 5 items in your bedrooms app: bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, bedroom 4, bedroom 5. And there's no real good way to do this. But what we can do is we could build a JSON array of numbers between start and finish, and then use the for each. Like I said, you can for each any variable that's been collected with a remote post get, but you can't do this. If I just build this JSON myself and then I try to for each, it won't work. But we can trick GlobiFlow into thinking we've collected the variable from a remote post get by just going get localhost, and then for the rest of the flow, GlobiFlow thinks the variable that's named counter array was collected via a remote post get, and if it has JSON in it, the for each function will work. So here's me building another function foo. I say I have number 5, and I'm using a for function. Another reason why these function foos are really handy, you can go and basically learn PHP, and there's a lot of stuff, and all the stuff that's contained in this info window. These are all PHP functions. To save your flow some real estate, there's a lot of stuff that you can get done even inside a single variable by just writing a function for it. So I'm creating my array here, and then I have my JSON array at the end of it. And now if I simulate variables, I will get an item for each number: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I could say create an item in bedrooms, call it bedroom, JSON decode the number that I'm using, and it would be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. So again, another real world example of how arrays are super handy. Okay, now let's talk about proc_foo and how it relates to arrays and how we would actually see it used. So here is a real world example. This is me using the proc_foo function for getting a Podio view. I've indicated the app ID, I've indicated the view ID, how many items I want to see. There's only 3 items in there anyway. And I want it to be raw, which means I want it to be the full payload of the Podio item, everything about it. And then we're going to see what it looks like. And then I'm using the base64 encode function because some of these items may have escaped characters, or unescaped characters I should say, in their payloads, like double quotes and stuff. And by doing it in this fashion, I will always ensure that I get the right format, and I will be able to call from an array perspective all of the individual data bits inside that array. So if I simulate variables here, I'm getting the Podio view, and then I'm for each of those arrays that come back using the same variable name, and now we can see the whole entire raw payload as a PHP array just for display purposes, and it's the whole payload of the item. Now I couldn't do anything with that, but I could grab an individual piece of information if I wanted to by just putting the key at the end. So let's say I wanted the item IDs. So now I'm only going to get the item ID. So if you look at the body of the response, and what the raw Podio item looks like, then you'll be able to say, okay, I want to be able to use keys in order to get what I want. So I can also, let's just look at an example to go 2 keys deep. Let's go back and look at them again. Okay, so we can see that, so created by is an array. So let's say I wanted to see the ID of the person who created the item. I would need to use the key for created by, and then I would need to use the key for ID. So if I go created by, and then I forgot what it was already. ID. Okay, I thought it was user ID. So created by ID. And then simulate variables again. I could get that piece of information. So once you start to understand how these key value pairs work, and then you can use them to grab any bit of information out of the JSON that you want. It all depends on what APIs you're using or the complexity of your objects. So that's me getting information from an API or from Podio or using proc_foo. I know I'm getting JSON as a response. How do I deal with it? This is a very basic example of me just getting a bunch of items from a view, for eaching them, and then what I have to actually do in order to get the information, and adding keys if I want, which you're most likely going to use because you want specific bits of information. So now that you know more about JSON, let me bring something else to your attention that you might not be aware of, and that is, in GlobiFlow, you can create feeds, app feeds, and you can call URLs where you can get the items in these feeds as JSON objects. So it's another way of basically getting information from GlobiFlow already in JSON format that you can then use change the key names if you have to, or do whatever you have to do to store it or to pass it on to wherever it's going. So this is a JSON feed configuration, and I checked the 4 fields that I've got there. I can choose to use a filter also if I want. Like, let's say I only want items in this feed where the category equals option 1. And these are you work these in exactly the same way you would work like an if statement in GlobiFlow. You would write your expression here. I'm going to leave that blank for now. So this is me getting information again from a GlobiFlow JSON feed, and I put in my parameters here. So this is returning my JSON. I'm using the base64 encode option, and then I can simulate variables and get them in exactly the same fashion. So again, once you know more about JSON, you can start to use these items and try to find your own uses for them. They can help you save a lot of time. Now that you again know a little bit more about JSON, you can sort of look at proc_foo. If proc_foo has been a little bit more confusing for you, you can kind of look at it from a different perspective. And then you see a lot of reference to JSON objects. Like, how do I build? What does it want when you say a JSON object? So here's a perfect example. This is a very basic proc_foo script updating the fields of a particular item. I need to feed it the Podio item ID. I need to feed all of the parameters that go into the remote post to proc_foo, the Podio item ID, a JSON array of fields. We're using the external IDs to update these. You can also use the field numerical ID. If you don't know where to get these, you would go into the developer section of any Podio app and scroll down, and then you can see the external ID of the field or the numeric field ID of the field. Either one of these will work. So when you're using proc_foo to update items and you say, okay, which key value pairs do I use? Which fields? How do I reference what field I want to update? This is how you do it, and this is what you have to feed it. Now we can see from our conversation earlier about data types, what it is that each of these fields is supposed to take in. Number is supposed to take in an integer. Okay? Category fields are technically supposed to take in an integer value of the option. Each one maintains its own integer value, but proc_foo lets you use text, and then it will do all the hard work for you. So some things with proc_foo will let you use strings across the board, and sometimes strings will be converted into the right format. Generally, if you're using strings, you're safe, but just important to note, you can see like what the Podio API wants as a value for the particular type of field you're using, and you can go learn more about that. Just learn, go now and study the Podio API documentation, because more of it might make sense to you. So this is an example of me actually updating items. Okay, this is sort of two things in combination, and it's not a real real world example, but just to show you me getting something and then making an update to it. So I'm calling my JSON feed again. And then I already know what I'm going to get, and I get the base64 encoded version, and then I can for each of these items to break them down. When we saw before, this feed returns the external IDs. That's how these GlobiFlow JSON feeds work. It returns the external ID of the field and then the value that happens to be in that field. So if we wanted to break this particular bit down, these are the keys that we would have to use. So now over here I'm saying, okay, I want the item ID of the item in question that I want to make the update to. So I break it down, I get the item ID. Then I'm building a JSON encode. I'm using JSON encode to build an array of the changes I want to make. I want to update the category field. I want everything to be option 1. If we go back just for a moment, you can see I see 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. I want everything to be option 1, and I want all the numbers to be 99. And then I pass the item ID and the values for my new bit to proc_foo. See Podio item ID equals the item ID, values equals values, and then I could choose to include hooks or make it silent if I wanted to. Those are extra options. So now if I simulate variables here, we're grabbing all 3 of these items. We're saying these are the values we want them to be. And now when I refresh and I can see the result, everything is option 1 and everything is 99. So that's how, if you don't know anything about arrays before you started watching this, hopefully you can see how much value you can get out of proc_foo now in GlobiFlow. And it's really just about grabbing data from different places, not being so rigidly, the only two ways you can get Podio items are get referenced or get Podio view. I mean, that's basically it. So if you want information that's coming from different places and it has to go beyond that, you can see how powerful arrays are for you. And you can do a lot of different things with them. And if you want to use proc_foo, and you can see the value we've already sort of expressed here, you have to know a little bit about JSON, and hopefully you've gotten that now as a result of this little talk. So that's not everything. This is already a long enough video, and I knew it was going to be long, but I just wanted to sort of go over the basics of what actually JSON is, how it uses proc_foo. These are very basic concepts that get way more complicated, and we can't talk about everything in the base of this one video. But hopefully now you have a good base, and you can use this information to go do your own tinkering, um, your own testing. Go and look at a bit of API documentation now. And if you go and look, just as a final thought here, if you go to the Podio API documentation, okay, and you get an item, and you see this is the response. So this is a JSON array. So the item ID, app, and it says that the app is an array of information. Okay, initial revision, fields is an array of information. So you can start to look at this stuff and kind of understand what it is. And I know how difficult it is to look at JSON. I know, and that's why I really recommend you get something that makes it easier to look at. If I go and grab, let me just as one final example again, grab a Podio item raw from proc_foo. Oh, I'm using the wrong account. So it gives us back to us in JSON as it would. That's what the Podio API would return. But this is hard to look at, and it's a lot of information. So if we have these handy viewers, I can go and drop this whole payload in here, format it to make it look pretty, as the Podio API documentation tries to do for us, and also work with it in this viewer function. So, oh, maybe I should refresh. Here we go. So now I can look and see, okay, and from a JSON decode perspective, if I wanted the item ID, I would JSON decode, base64 decode, blah, 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 blah. Key would be item ID. Okay? Here's an indexed array of rights. I could get rights 0. I could get created by ID, created by image, hosted by. I could get fields 0, config, or values 0, value. Okay, that's a big. That's why proc_foo is awesome, because that's how I would get the value of that field if I was using the Podio API directly, and I'd probably have to for each of these fields. But proc_foo actually allows you to grab the fields from a Podio item where all the keys intact, so you can just grab whatever you want. But you can see using a JSON viewer is really handy when you're dealing with these massive objects and you're not quite sure what you're always looking at. So that's a basic overview of arrays, basic overview of JSON and how it works and how it relates to proc_foo. I'll put this up. Happy to answer any questions. I